The eternal curse of blood vessels. Grimes Hollow had always been a quiet town, nestled deep in the misty woods, where even the sun seemed reluctant to shine. The town's eerie isolation only added to its strange and unsettling history, filled with whispered rumors of vanishings, blood rituals, and old, forgotten curses. The townsfolk kept to themselves, rarely venturing into the dark forests surrounding the town, and those who did were never seen again. Dr. Evelyn Marshall was an outsider. She had moved to Grimes Hollow years ago, seeking peace after the tragic and unsolved death of her husband, a man she had loved deeply. She had taken over the town's small clinic and quickly became known for her expertise in human anatomy and her obsession with the mysteries of the human body. She spent long hours studying cadavers, mapping out veins and arteries, and investigating the strange occurrences that plagued the town's people. Little did she know, her insatiable curiosity would soon lead her into the grip of something far darker than any disease or physical ailment. It began on a stormy night when a stranger arrived at her clinic. Charles, a gaunt man with hollow eyes and skin stretched tightly over his bones, appeared at her doorstep in the middle of the night, drenched from the torrential downpour. His eyes, wide with fear, seemed to hold a terrible secret, and his voice trembled as he spoke. "Help me, doctor. I've been marked. It's in my veins." Against her better judgment, Evelyn took him in. She had seen many strange cases before, but there was something about this man that unsettled her. His skin was almost translucent, and his veins seemed to pulse unnaturally beneath the surface. His breath was shallow, and his body smelled faintly of decay. Charles insisted that he was cursed, but Evelyn was skeptical. She thought it might be a psychological affliction, or perhaps a rare condition affecting his blood vessels. Regardless, she needed to examine him. She hooked him up to a medical IV drip to keep him stable, but as she began her examination, she noticed something strange. His veins were not like normal human veins. They were thick, dark, and twisted in patterns that didn't belong. Evelyn's fingers brushed lightly against the surface of his arm, and that's when she noticed the pulse of his veins, strong, rhythmic, like the beating of a distant heart. She pulled back, a chill creeping down her spine. Unable to resist her curiosity, Evelyn prepared a small incision to collect a blood sample. But as soon as the blade cut through his skin, something indescribable happened. Black, viscous fluid poured out of his veins, thick as tar and stinking of rot. Evelyn recoiled in horror as the blood splattered across the sterile white sheets, leaving a dark stain that seemed to spread like an oil spill. What is this?" she whispered, heart pounding. Charles' body trembled violently, his eyes rolling back in his skull. His lips parted as though trying to speak, but all that emerged was a guttural, inhuman growl. The veins beneath his skin bulged, pulsing as though they were alive, stretching and twisting in grotesque patterns that were entirely unnatural. The room grew colder as his body convulsed, and his chest heaved with each breath, faster and faster, until he was no longer human. He was a vessel of something ancient and evil. Evelyn stumbled backward, heart racing. She tried to step away, but the room felt smaller, the walls inching closer with every passing second. A violent pressure built in her chest, and the air felt thick, suffocating. Charles' body began to contort in ways that defied the human form, his skin stretching and cracking, his veins pushing against the surface, bulging out of his limbs like thick roots. The pulse of the veins became deafening, a rhythmic pounding that shook the room. The sound of his veins shifting was like the deep groan of the earth, and the blood continued to pour from him, a torrent of black ichor. Suddenly, with an explosive force, his veins ruptured, sending a geyser of thick, dark blood splattering across the walls. The liquid splashed across Evelyn's face, and she gagged, the taste of iron and decay overwhelming her senses. The room filled with the stench of death as Charles' body convulsed one last time, his limbs snapping unnaturally as his skin melted away, revealing the grotesque mass of veins beneath. Evelyn screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the terrible sound of Charles' body rupturing completely. His blood vessels expanded outward, tearing through his flesh and spilling across the floor, merging with the blood already pooled in the room. The very air seemed to vibrate with the force of the pulsating veins, the walls themselves trembling as if the curse was alive, spreading through the very structure of the building. With one final, bone-shattering crack, Charles' body collapsed into a heap of mangled flesh, but the veins continued to writhe and pulse, even without a body to sustain them. Evelyn's own veins began to throb in time with the beat of the dark blood that now filled the room, her skin burning with an unnatural heat. Her heart raced as she felt the sinister power surging through her own blood vessels, her fingers trembling as they reached for her scalpel. She couldn't stop herself, she had to sever the connection, cut herself free of the curse before it consumed her entirely. But as the scalpel sliced into her arm, something worse happened. The blood that spilled from her veins was no longer hers, it was black, like the tar that had poured from Charles' body. It burned her flesh as it leaked from her skin, and her blood vessels began to twist and coil beneath her skin, as if responding to an unseen force. The walls of the room closed in on her, the veins creeping along the floor like tendrils, dragging her closer to the center of the room. She screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the pulsating rhythm of the blood. The last thing she saw before her vision faded was the message that had been written in black blood on the wall: "The vessel is eternal." The next morning, the clinic was discovered, abandoned and soaked in blood. But Dr. Evelyn Marshall was nowhere to be found. The clinic's floors were covered in chunks of flesh and blood-soaked bandages, but the walls seemed to be growing darker, the veins beneath the paint pulsing faintly, as if alive. Weeks passed, and the townsfolk began to notice a strange change in their own bodies. Their veins began to ache, their skin grew cold, and they felt an insatiable thirst that could not be quenched. Some spoke of whispers in the dark, of unseen forces pulling at their blood, but most just tried to ignore it. Yet, late at night, when the wind howled through the trees, and the streets were silent, a strange sound could be heard from Dr. Marshall's clinic, the faint, rhythmic clicking of blood vessels pulsing in the dark, a haunting reminder that the curse of Grimes Hollow was far from over. And as the veins of the town began to stretch and grow, the people of Grimes Hollow knew one thing for certain: the blood vessel was eternal. And it was coming for them all.